got to do first and get to the fun stuff. He's the president of the National Council of Churches, the most significant, historic, ecumenical Christian organization in American history. Before that, he was the General Secretary of the United Methodist Board of Church and Society. The United Methodist Church, the most American church representing our political positions on Capitol Hill. But now let me tell you the more important stuff. Jim and I have been friends, how long did you say? 34 years. We were like 2 when we first met. Actually, we met as a part of the United Methodist Church's mission intern program. We were trained with about 20 couple other young adults, sent out 2 by 2 around the world to do reverse mission. We were sent out to the world to learn that we could come back to Methodist churches in the States and educate them about the reality of the churches we're experiencing around the world. I got sent to Argentina, which was then under a military dictatorship. Every day of my life doing human rights work, I was in danger. Jim was in the Fiji Islands, saying he was studying the effects of transnational corporations on the Fiji Islands, but his colleague there was studying the effects of tourism. And I think they did a lot of research together on the beaches of Fiji Islands. But more seriously, one of the things I've always admired about Jim is Jim just knows so darn much. He remembers more facts. And I remember our group would be training and we were all passionate and angry, and somebody would throw out some fact or some purported fact, and somebody else would say, I'm not sure that's quite right. And Jim would disappear. And this was before internet. This was at Mercy College in Detroit, before internet. Jim would disappear. And 3 hours later, he would come back from the library with a legal pad, 4 or 5 pages of notes. And he would straighten us out on the facts. And now, well, the only thing I noticed differently is he doesn't have the legal pad. It's all up here. And so, Jim, he says I've been blunt with him over the years. Jim, you're a walking Wikipedia. But some of it isn't true. Can't wait to hear you.
I'll tell you why I don't carry around the legal pad. Thank goodness for the iPad. Man, oh man, every night. Let's look that up. It's wonderful. He's checking it on, and believe me, I've already been made aware that tonight the Dodgers and Phillies are on TV, and the Yankees and the Red Sox. So I think that was a way of saying don't talk forever, and I doubt that anyone wants to hear me talk forever. But I am really grateful for the chance to be here with you at Shenandoah and back in Winchester. I've been here a number of times and really feel a kinship with this university and very much admire all that happens here. I had the chance to speak to Barry's class earlier this afternoon, and then to participate in the dinner where we celebrated John. And I want to again just say a word of thanks to John for his leadership in the Valley Interfaith Council, and I'm honored that he asked me to come out here and be here as we celebrate his leadership, and as we wish him well as he moves into retirement. So when he and I were speaking, we talked about what I might touch on tonight. And the title we came up with, I think you've seen it, is Shoulder to Shoulder, the Importance of Interfaith Advocacy for Justice. So I'll share a little bit also about how I came to be here. It was interesting hearing about John asking permission to be arrested. I've been arrested several times in protests over the years. Most recently, about 4 years ago at the Capitol, when a group of religious leaders protested against cuts that were proposed in human needs programs. My dad reminds me that he's been arrested many times more than myself for political demonstrations. And that's really the atmosphere, in a sense, that I was raised in as a preacher's kid in the Midwest, son of a father who spoke against the Vietnam War and on behalf of civil rights, and that helped shape me as a young Christian. I was raised, I guess, really, I have to say, in a Methodist cocoon. There was a long Methodist heritage on each side of my family, and of course, as a preacher's family, we're literally raised in the church. In fact, I realized that one of the things that helped prepare me for being president of the National Council of Churches was that from an early age, when you are the preacher's kid, everybody in the congregation watches you, how you behave, and so you act out anyway, of course. In fact, one of the churches where Dad was a pastor had a sanctuary that had a sloping floor like this, and there was nothing more exciting for my brother and sister and I than to roll under the pews down from the back to the front. It didn't necessarily have great consequences back home, but it was great fun. So I was raised in the church, but I guess I came to realize my father also, though, was active in ecumenical and interfaith work with other clergy in the towns and cities where he was a pastor. And then, as Gary said, after college I was with the Pacific Conference of Churches and worked even there in ecumenical fashion, as well as across faith lines. And when I came back to the United States and worked here for a number of years, I started leading summer schools of Christian mission. And I remember one year the topic was living in an interfaith world. The United Methodist Women, and some of you are very familiar, I'm sure. In fact, how many of you have been at schools of Christian mission? I see some hands up right here. So this is an important institution in the United Methodist Church, and it's been reproduced in a variety of ways in other denominations. But one year I was asked to teach interfaith relations. So I was in the South Georgia Annual Conference, and I had a brainstorm just before my first class session. And I altered my class teaching plan, and I said, let's go around the room. This is 20 years ago. And I'd like you to tell me what interfaith experience you've had personally. This was rural Georgia. And there was silence. And I said, well, let's just go around the room. Well, I know some Southern Baptists. And there were a few people who knew some Jews, but they were really straining. And so I went back to my room and rewrote a lot of my lesson plan because I had assumed there was a broader awareness and familiarity with people of other faiths. And I think that in the 20 years since then, that has taken place across this country. Not in every nook and cranny, of course. But you know, a lot of what changed things here was the 1965 Immigration Act. One of my favorite classes at George Mason University when I was working on my master's degree in history about 25 years ago was immigration history. And that 1965 Immigration Act really reversed the 1924 Immigration Act in the United States, which had severely restricted immigration and kept out a lot of Jewish refugees during World War II. And one of the reasons that Congress passed the 1924 Immigration Act was because they didn't like the fact that lots of Jews and Catholics were coming in from Southern and Eastern Europe into this country. And that was led by a lot of Protestants, speaking as a Protestant, who didn't want that kind of diversity in the United States. But by 1965, the thinking was, let's reform our immigration system so that Northern Europeans can resume immigration. That was the thinking, that Irish and English and Germans would start coming back over here. But after World War II, this was 20 years, Europe had begun to reconstruct itself. And in most immigration patterns, people don't leave where they live if there's not a real need to. They prefer to live among their family and friends and communities where their people have been from for a long time. So what happened was that people came here from Africa, Asia, Latin America, people from many faiths. When I was a kid, ethnic food in the United States was Mexican food, pizza, and Chinese food. And now you can get everything. It's absolutely fabulous what has happened here. And it's changed also the face of American religion so that we work much more ecumenically and interfaith. So the Valley Interfaith Council, I think, exemplifies and embodies these changes that have resulted in this nation in just 50 years, really. And as these relationships have developed, so too we have begun working literally shoulder to shoulder in solidarity with one another. So let me say a little bit about this. And first, if I may, just a few words about taking leadership of the National Council of Churches of Christ in the United States of America, which goes back almost more than 100 years, when we first created the Federal Council of Churches here in the U.S. And after World War II, the Federal Council of Churches morphed into the National Council of Churches, but it wasn't just a name change, because there were a number of organizations that came together. Now, I was a history major, so you're going to have to bear with me. I find this really interesting. The 8 merging agencies that created the National Council of Churches in 1950 were, of course, the Federal Council of Churches, the Foreign Missions Conference of North America, the Home Mission Council of North America, the International Council of Religious Education, the Missionary Education Movement of the United States and Canada, the National Protestant Council on Higher Education, the United Stewardship Council, and the United Council of Church Women. So a lot of strands of American religious history came together into what is now the National Council of Churches, which is also composed of 37 member denominations. Some of the traditional mainline Protestant churches, such as the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the United Methodist Church, the Presbyterian Church USA, the American Baptist Church, the Episcopal Church, some of the historic African American denominations, such as the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the Progressive National Baptist Convention, which was started by Dr. King, the National Missionary Baptist Convention, a number of other African American denominations, and Orthodox churches, the Armenian Orthodox Church, the Syrian Orthodox Church, the Coptic Orthodox Church, the Greek Orthodox Church, and several other Orthodox denominations, and also some of the historic peace churches, such as Quakers and Brethren, are part of the National Council of Churches. So this is a large segment of American religion that's made up, that's composed as the National Council of Churches. About 140,000 local churches across the country and nearly 40 million people are part of the National Council. And why, though, would there have been the creation of the National Council of Churches? It seems to me that there was an effort that started about 125 years ago, led by groups like the YMCA, the YWCA, the Student Christian Movement. It was really young people who began pushing for more unity within the Christian community in the United States, and actually worldwide. So, in a sense, this began as a youth movement. After the death of Christ, of course, the churches began to gradually move apart, partly understandably. You had churches that planted in Iraq and Syria and Egypt and Ethiopia and Armenia and moved up into Russia and into the Balkans and so forth, and of course gradually spread into Western Europe. After Islam rose, then much of Eastern Orthodoxy lost members to Islam. But Eastern Orthodox churches still remain very important historically, but there began to be a split, of course, between Catholics and Orthodox, later between Protestants and Catholics. And so for hundreds and hundreds of years, there were significant splits with not much conversation. So when this youth effort grew 100+ years ago to push for Christian unity, it grabbed the attention and the imagination of churches who began to say, it's not really all about being Methodist born and Methodist bred, and when you die, you're Methodist dead. Or Presbyterian, or Lutheran, or Orthodox, or whatever. But rather, it's about being a faithful Christian. So in our higher education institutions, particularly our seminaries, we began to teach our up-and-coming pastors that that's what really the goal and the ideal was. And then they began, in these many, many congregations around the country, starting to tell folks, it's okay if the folks down the street are of a different flock, because it's really more important about us being faithful Christians. In fact, of course, there was a desire for a long time to melt these denominations into one. When I was in the Pacific Islands, I went to Papua New Guinea. Papua New Guinea had been an Australian colony, and it became independent in 1975. I arrived there in 1981, and I met with the church leaders of the Uniting Church of Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. And they sat me down, this 22-year-old kid, and they said, we have a question for you. After the Australians left, and after we gained control of these various denominations, such as the Lutherans, Methodists, and Presbyterians, we looked at each other and said, that was the Europeans' problem, having all these different denominations. We're all for Papua New Guinea and the Solomon Islands. Let's have one church. And they said, and we accomplished it. And now, here come the Mormons, and here come the Assembly of God, and here come the Seventh-day Adventists, and on and on and on. Why are you, pointing at me, still sending more churches from America to divide us now that we've achieved unity? That was a very powerful and fascinating question for which I had no answer, but it woke me up to this persistent disunity that marks us even, of course, to this day. Though there's something interesting here, because as these denominations held on to this dream of unity and downplayed their tribal affiliations, if you will, their denominational tribal affiliations, they, in a sense, began to sow the seeds of their own demise. Because after all, you were generations long Methodist or Presbyterian and so forth and so on. And now it was suddenly permission was given to move across denominational lines. And people do this very easily now in this nation. I used to lead the new member class at Messiah United Methodist Church in Springfield, Virginia. And when I would lead it, the first thing I would do, I would say, let's go around the room and tell me what, if any, church you grew up in. As we're, the hallmark now of this country is disaffiliation from any faith. So people would say, oh, I grew up in military-based chapels. We weren't far from the Pentagon. I grew up Presbyterian, United Methodist, Southern Baptist, Roman Catholic. In fact, we were a refugee center for Roman Catholics and Southern Baptists. And I said, okay, well, why are you joining this church? They weren't joining it because it was Methodist. We love the pastor, the choir, the youth ministry program, the divorce recovery workshop, the singles ministry. That's why they were coming to this church. But they also, I realized, felt comfortable in a church that was not solely inwardly focused, but one that was concerned about poverty and hunger and violence and racism. A church that was committed to working with others across other faith lines to work together to make the world, to make it on earth as it is in heaven. So these are powerful currents that have evolved here in many ways in a positive fashion in this nation over these past 50 years. And so I worked for a long time on Capitol Hill in public policy advocacy with the United Methodist Church. And as I say, to do anything successfully, anything, we had to do it across faith lines. Now, interestingly, the United Methodists really had the first public policy office of any denomination in Washington. And why was that? Well, 100 years ago, Methodists opposed alcohol. We wanted an amendment to the Constitution to prohibit the sale, production, manufacture of alcohol in this country. Well, it sounds, in a way, it sounds quaint. It almost sounds, maybe even sounds kind of silly. But why were the Methodists so passionate about alcohol? Well, there were a couple of reasons. On the positive side, it was a public health concern because drunkenness and alcoholism was a huge problem in the United States. But also, consumption of alcohol was associated with, among others, Roman Catholics. So, the United Methodist building on Capitol Hill was built explicitly to counter rising Roman Catholic influence in the nation's capital, as well as to fight for prohibition, to fight against gambling, motion pictures, prize fighting, and a variety of, and immigration, among other things. So the years evolved, and United Methodists, like a lot of others, began to be convicted by Dr. King and the civil rights struggle, and forced to face the sin of white supremacy and racism in this country. And that began to transform things to a significant degree, as well as the King, followed by the rise of the National Council of Churches and other denominational offices, including Roman Catholic and Jewish offices in Washington, and later on Muslim offices. And now we're beginning to see the Jains and the Sikhs and the Buddhists and the Hindus all on the scene in Washington. So there were several things that, out of this United Methodist heritage that I was part of, were part of who we are. One of them was not just alcohol, but tobacco. United Methodists were passionately concerned about tobacco. Now, for a long time, that wasn't the case in Virginia and North Carolina, where alcohol, or rather where tobacco was quite profitable. But gradually, the whole church became convinced that tobacco had to be regulated. And there was a movement that was started by the American Cancer Society, the American Lung Association, the American Health Association, American Medical Association, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, and these groups. We have to bring tobacco under regulation. There was more regulation of what goes into dog food than to what goes into tobacco products, such as chewing tobacco and cigarettes and cigars and pipe tobacco and so forth. But we could never accomplish it because of the power of big tobacco in Washington. So they beat their head against the wall for a number of years, and we in the churches sort of cheered them on from the sidelines. But then they came to us and they said, we think we have failed to articulate an important aspect of this concern. We've talked about it from a social science, from a public health, from a public policy view, but this is also a moral and ethical concern, and we want you to be with us. We should have taken up the struggle much earlier, but we woke up when they came to us, and so I became chair of Faiths United Against Tobacco in 2000. And very quickly, the Islamic Society for North America, the Seventh-day Adventist, the Southern Baptist Convention, a number of groups that had this heritage of opposition to tobacco joined in. Eventually more than 30 faith groups, Jewish, Catholic, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, and Sikhs were part of this coalition. And for 9 years we pushed on Capitol Hill for regulation of tobacco, and it finally passed just after Barack Obama became president. So I was invited to the White House for the signing of the bill. And I get there, and it's a hot, sunny summer day in the Rose Garden. And we can see Barack Obama sitting in the air-conditioned Oval Office a few feet away as we were sweating there in the Rose Garden. I grabbed a seat in about the third row, and someone came over from the White House staff and said, "We actually have a seat for you in the front row." I said, "Oh." I moved to the front row. There was my name on a seat. I was chair of Faiths United Against Tobacco. And everyone's milling around, and someone comes rushing down to the front, irate, and tells the White House staff about how She should be in the front row. And they all turn and look at me, and I said, I'm not giving up this spot. We worked hard for passage of federal regulation of tobacco, but it was a great moment of interfaith solidarity with secular groups, public health groups, and it showed to me the power of interfaith advocacy. After that, we've tackled gun violence. Needless to say, we still have that struggle going on now. I became chair of Faiths United to Prevent Gun Violence. And I think that the example of the struggle against tobacco gave us credibility because very quickly more than 50 faith groups signed on to this effort. And we've been seeking what I believe are common sense policies. We're not calling for a ban on the existence or ownership of handguns. What we're calling for are background checks for background checks. What else? We're concerned about criminals having access to guns and other basic measures so that handguns can be more securely registered and accounted for in this nation. And on that matter, we have not yet been successful. But we've stood very closely with Mayors Against Illegal Guns, which Mayor Bloomberg of New York City has worked closely with, and with the Brady campaign, named for, of course, Jim Brady, Ronald Reagan's former press secretary, who was shot during the assassination attempt on Ronald Reagan in 1981. And I'm convinced that we will accomplish, I don't know how long it will take, but I believe that we will accomplish federal common sense reform and protection of American people from this rampant handgun violence that claims thousands upon thousands of people's lives each year. I will tell you that as much and as important and as valuable as it is for these national faith organizations to work across denominational and faith lines in solidarity, what members of Congress are always looking for is, you may have a fancy title such as President of the National Council of Churches, but how many phone calls am I getting from people back in my district? And if I'm not hearing from them, then I don't care about the nice, eloquent letter that you've written or the repeated appeals you've made for this kind of legislation. There's nothing, in my experience, that members of Congress like more than being elected than being reelected. And they pay attention. We may think they don't, and not all of them pay attention the way we want them to, but they pay attention to what people back home are saying. I have been in members of Congress office waiting to meet with them when a congressperson will walk in and say to the person at the front desk, "What's the count?" So there's usually, of course, something on the floor, some legislation on the floor of the House or the Senate, and they're asking, what are you hearing from back home? Is it 10-1? Is it 50-1? Is it split? They pay attention to who is turning out the numbers of phone calls, letters, emails, and so forth. So I urge you to be ready to speak on that issue. You know, and to try to develop this grassroots support that's so crucial. Starting in 2013, we held Gun Violence Sabbath Weekend. And about 400 congregations commemorated it across the nation. And we knew we weren't going to get a lot of participation the first year. We did it again just last month, actually, in March, the second Gun Violence Sabbath Weekend, and had 1,000 congregations. And I'm talking about synagogues, mosques, and churches that commemorated Gun Violence Sabbath Weekend. So we know this is about building momentum. This is about mobilizing the grassroots of our faith groups. I was speaking to a group recently, and I said, Faiths United Against Gun Violence represents the spectrum from A to W, from the African American Ministers in Action to the World Sikh Council. And I said, now we need to get the Zoroastrians involved. And in the group was the head of the Federation of Zoroastrians of North America, and he said, we'll sign on. So we're now A to Z on Faiths United to Prevent Gun Violence. I'll just touch on one more example of interfaith advocacy that I've been part of, and that is literally called Shoulder to Shoulder. And some of you are aware of it. It is an effort to protect, a multi-faith effort to protect Muslims in this country from the persecution that they've experienced in recent years. In fact, 4 years ago, we held a press conference in Washington at which the formation of Shoulder to Shoulder was announced. And there were 40 religious leaders, Jews, Christians, and Muslims who were present. And I'll just read an excerpt from what we said that day. As religious leaders in this great country, we have come together in our nation's capital to denounce categorically the derision, misinformation, and outright bigotry being directed against America's Muslim community. We bear a sacred responsibility to honor America's varied faith traditions and to promote a culture of mutual respect and the assurance of religious freedom for all. In advance of the 9th anniversary of the terrorist attacks of 9/11, we announce a new era of interfaith cooperation. So, Shoulder to Shoulder has become an important part of the landscape, and when an incident takes place, we respond. But beyond that, there are a number of initiatives that have unfolded. I'll give you some examples. There's the Christian-Muslim Consultative Group in Southern California, the Daughters of Abraham Interfaith Book Group, Interfaith Paths to Peace, New Ground, a Muslim-Jewish Partnership for Change, the Safe Nation Collaborative, aimed at bridging the gap between law enforcement and the Muslim community, the Tri-Faith Initiative of Omaha, Nebraska, and the Weekend of Twinning, a weekend in which mosques and synagogues are paired together around the country. So there's real substance beyond public policy advocacy in Washington to the grassroots of congregations all across this nation as we're building community with one another to really, I think, transform a culture that has become suffused with violence and paranoia and fear as we are, in a sense, I think, still recovering from the terrorist attacks of 9/11. And frankly, the violence that we have visited upon the people of Iraq and Afghanistan and other places around the world requires them to recover in ways far more profoundly than what we are having to recover from here. Let me conclude. What is most satisfying in life, I have found, is being in relationship with others, serving our neighbors, and seeking to bring peace and justice to the world. At its best, religion plays an important role in building community, helping those in need, bringing people together, and being a force for good. Once you understand this, I don't see how you can turn a blind eye to persecution of our neighbors, to rampaging gun violence, to public health travesties such as tobacco abuse and other problems, homelessness and hunger. And so, as we go forward, I think that it's crucial we feel ourselves renewed in our spirits and our resolve to bring peace to a hurting world, prepared to share God's love, and to remind the world, as the Beatles so eloquently put it, in the end, the love you get is equal to the love you make. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Jim, and we'll have some time for some, well, you left us a good bit of time for some questions and discussion. And I'm going to ask you to address one thing you told me you were going to talk about, which is there's a new initiative, there's been some tensions and some renewed conversations among Jews and Christians that you're a part of. And I think a lot of us here are interested in that discussion, and I know it's in early stages. So if you could say just a word about that, and then let's take whatever questions you all may have, because I know several of you have mentioned and perhaps here are interested in hearing that. So thank you.
I'll touch on what John just mentioned, but I also want to say one other thing. I want to make an advertisement. Next month, May 18 to 20, the National Council of Churches is going to have its first ever Christian Unity Gathering at the Hilton Dulles Hotel. And I've got a flyer here. We're going to focus on mass incarceration, which is just a plague that is affecting our nation with millions of people in jail, in prison. You know, it's really, Michelle Alexander began to wake us up, didn't she, with that amazing book, The New Jim Crow, about mass incarceration. And so we're going to have Dr. Iva Carruthers of the Samuel DeWitt Proctor Conference, Marion Wright Edelman of Children's Defense Fund, Dr. Harold Dean Trulier of Howard School of Divinity, Jim Wallace of Sojourners, among others, be speakers at this conference. So I've got flyers here, and I hope that we can spread those around. And I particularly want you all to know, because we have a local option. If you don't want to spend the money for a hotel, you just want to come for a day or something, we have a very affordable rate. I think it's like $10 just to come and participate for a day. But I hope that you'll participate in this. So when John and I were talking on the phone about interfaith advocacy, I mentioned to him that one of the things I've been part of for about 10 years has been a Jewish-Christian dialogue. Now, there's been a lot of Jewish-Christian dialogues around this nation, of course, over the years. But what precipitated this particular dialogue was when a close friend of mine, Rabbi David Elcott, then of the American Jewish Committee, came to me and he said, you know, we talk about interfaith work. Your interreligious people talk to our interreligious people. There will be exchanges of pulpits with synagogues and churches. There's visits, there's community building. That's great. He said, and we'll talk about our different understanding of our faiths. But what we want to talk about is our differences around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And in particular, we want to talk to the public policy staff of major denominations, Lutherans, Methodists, Presbyterians, and so forth. And so we commenced that dialogue. It was simultaneously, I would say from my experience, fascinating, fantastic, wonderful, and frustrating as the years went on. We went to Israel together and Palestine together. We had a lot of great conversation and learning. And it had its fits and starts, but it was moving along. And then we created a second table to kind of pick up and deepen this interfaith conversation that was taking place. But in October of 2012, 40 denominational leaders sent a letter to Capitol Hill, to Congress, calling for an investigation, not a cutoff, but an investigation of whether or not U.S. military aid to Israel was being used by Israel in human rights abuses against Palestinians. That resulted in a suspension of the dialogue. And there were, as you can imagine, lots of conversations going on still around the edges for a long time. And we continue to work very closely together on countless things around the country and on Capitol Hill. But March 27, I was part of a group of Christian leaders that met at the Jewish Council on Public Affairs in New York City with a group of Jewish leaders. And while we acknowledge that we don't agree completely on how to solve the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, we agreed that we were going to not only resume the dialogues of those two tables, but the principals, shall we say, agreed that we want to continue to meet together. So it was I don't think there was a single person in the room who walked out without saying, wow, that went better than I thought. And so we're now, the person who was the co-chair, Bishop Mark Hansen of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, has retired. So I have now been assigned to be the co-chair along with Rabbi Steve Guto of the Jewish Council on Public Affairs. And Mark told me, I would talk to Steve in the morning when I woke up and at night before I went to bed. Then I would kiss my wife good night and good morning. So I've told Steve that I'll be happy to do the same with him. And we've known each other for a long time. But these discussions and dialogues, whether they're Christian-Muslim or Muslim-Jewish or Christian-Jewish or all three, and beyond that, are really crucial to deepening understanding and commitment. You know, one thing I noticed with reading the history of the Valley Interfaith Council, and some of the things that you all said tonight that I sensed, is that one of the things you all did for really this first number of years was build community with one another, and to have events together and hear speakers and so forth. And now I gather you're beginning to venture into public policy advocacy. And I thought to myself that was really, I applaud that, rather, because the easy thing to do is just jump right into advocating on whatever the public policy concern of the day is. And there are many that we're in a land plagued with injustice that we're all concerned about. And in fact, in that meeting when we gathered March 27th, we acknowledged before we got there that even though many of us recognized one another's names, most of us actually had never sat down together and hadn't met together. So we brought in two facilitators, one Christian, one Jewish, who really led us through some good old-fashioned icebreakers and discussions and so forth, so that we could say, now I have some sense of who you are, and who you are as a person, what's brought you to this place, and we can begin to communicate as people who know one another, and hopefully develop deep friendships as we move forward. Yes, sir.
Well, I suppose it would be appropriate for me to follow up on that particular area of dialogue. I'm not going to. One of the things that we're not talking about this evening is our relationship to denominations, whose not only theological but social and political perspective we don't share either. And for me, especially in this community, that wall of separation is one that continues to vex me. Can you take a moment and talk about what is the, if any, areas of dialogue that are going on between the progressive denominations and the evangelical community?
I think it's, even there, a lot of where we work together is on issues that we have common concern about. So Faith United Against Tobacco was a place. In fact, I'll be honest with you, as I became chair of Faith United Against Tobacco, when the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids came to me, I said, why are you coming to me? And they said, well, we learned that if we can get the Methodists, we can get everybody else. And I thought that was flattery, but then they explained it. They said in the United States, the largest denomination is the Roman Catholic Church, by far. The second largest religious grouping in this country is the Southern Baptist Convention, and the third largest is the United Methodist Church. And there's sort of some ethos. You know, Catholics certainly work ecumenically and interfaith. I'm just going to put it in my words, and I don't mean to offend anybody, but sometimes you stumble on the one true church element. Southern Baptists, and I have a great many Southern Baptist friends, don't even work well with other Baptists. The United Methodists kind of have this style of, oh, there's been a flood or a disaster. Let's roll up our sleeves and get to work. Oh, you're a Mormon, you're Muslim, that's great. Methodists, Mormons, Muslims, let's jump in together, let's do something. This is obviously a generalization, but they said, we find you all are large in number and you have this kind of style. So it helps to bring folks together. Now, what I found interesting, not just about being a United Methodist, but about some of these other major Protestant denominations that are often kind of considered as progressive, are actually incredibly diverse. If you really scratch below the surface, Methodists, Lutherans, Presbyterians, Episcopalians, and several other denominations, once you have any sense of these denominations, you realize, oh, I can't be easily categorized as liberal or as conservative. There's an amazing mix, even in, of course, in local churches. And many congregations in this country, you'll find a pretty homogeneous political viewpoint in those congregations, but not in some of these major Protestant denominations. But they have, over time, adopted what are considered progressive views on social concerns. And one of the things, and I know I'm getting to your question, but one of the things that I think that I faced was this. I would be in front of a group of United Methodists. Let's say this is a local church somewhere in this country. And I was, before I was at the National Council of Churches, I was with the Board of Church and Society. And someone would say, Jim, I simply cannot understand how the United Methodist Church opposes the death penalty. I mean, no one here in this local church opposes the death penalty. How did this happen? And so I would say, well, first of all, you're not the only United Methodist Church. There are thousands and thousands around the world. But I would tell them, I said, you really want to know the answer? I'll tell you. Our clergy drag us forward. And I said, I mean that in the best way. I said, think about it. I'm a layperson. And my brother's a pastor. So when my brother decided to go into the ministry, he, of course, went to seminary. Now, he's going into what we like to call full-time Christian work. So as a layperson, I want my pastor to not only be living the life of a clergy person, but to be struggling with the implications of the scriptures on daily issues, whether it's hunger, homelessness, violence, racism, war, peace, you name it. And I expect that person to preach the Word of God as they understand it from the pulpit. And I don't always agree with what's being said. Now, beyond that, the teaching and leading role of our clergy, we have it structured in many of these denominations so that they have a lot of votes at our decision-making level. Usually half the votes. Half are lay, half are clergy. But of course, most of the people in the church are lay. So I said, our lay people, our clergy, are the ones who grapple with this, who teach us and so forth, and often, have been in ecumenical and interfaith work. And they are, come on. I mean, if you're a Christian, that's what Jesus did. This is pulling us forward here into how we understand how we're to live our lives as faithful people. And so I think that a lot of these denominations have, and even a lot of people in the denominations will say, I've heard people say to me, well, I think the death penalty is fine. I don't think the church should support the death penalty. So there's even that acknowledgement to a certain extent. So I'll say first that it's a complicated world within the major mainline denominations that exist to this day. A split certainly took place a long time ago between those denominations and more evangelical, as they're called, or conservative, and of course, conservative, evangelical, fundamentalist, charismatic are different. They all have differences. But there's that grouping over there, shall we say. Now, we work together then on issues of common concern, even at the local level, of course. Many times in a local community, you'll have a food pantry or soup kitchen where most of the denominations and faith groups are together in that. But on our understanding of Scripture, there's often significant differences, of course, in our understanding of a lot of social concerns. So what I find is that we have more conversation going on about social concerns where we have where we're together than we do on theological differences. An example in Washington is the Circle of Protection. I don't know if you've heard of the Circle of Protection. It's a wonderful grouping. I was fortunate enough to be part of it as it began. The Conference of Catholic Bishops, Sojourners, Bread for the World, the National Council of Churches, the National Association of Evangelicals. That's a pretty broad spectrum of Christian America. And we have to work to make sure that we're all together, but we just said to one another, we want not just to be our own circle, but we want to form a circle of protection around programs that help the neediest among us, because those programs are under fire. Now, I was part of the beginning of Circle of Protection, and I will say that even within that setting, I argued for it to be multi-faith, because I said this is a struggle beyond Christians. And it was decided that there would be a group, Circle of Protection, that would be Christian-focused, partly because not everyone around the table works as comfortably interfaith as some of us do. But I went back to what's called the heads of Washington offices of the various denominations, which is multi-faith, and said we need to have a parallel campaign, not a conflicting campaign, but a parallel campaign that is interfaith. And that we started, was called the Faithful Budget Campaign. Now, there is one place in particular where I do see some serious work across theological and political divides, and that is in a grouping called Christian Churches Together, which started about 10 or 12 years ago. And it followed a model that has unfolded in several countries around the world. In those countries, as I understand it, the Council of Churches model essentially died out for a variety of reasons, oftentimes financial and so forth. Here, that didn't happen, but it was decided in kind of taking up that example, we would bring together Catholics, evangelicals, Pentecostals, Orthodox churches, African American churches, mainline Protestant churches. So Christian Churches Together works on a consensus model, so it moves slowly, but is and it's still developing. They had their annual conference a couple of months ago. It was the first time I ever attended, and they spoke together on the issue of mass incarceration. Next year, it's going to focus on immigration reform. So once again, you can see that where they can focus on something is often a social concern. And there has been a significant transition in the evangelical community in this country in the last 15 or 20 years on a couple of issues, climate change and poverty, as you all know. And there's a lot to be said there for folks like Jim Wallace of Sojourners, as well as for Rich Cizik, who was the Vice President of the National Association of Evangelicals and is now the head of New Evangelicals for the Common Good. And I used to think, I'll be honest with you, I used to think that they represented a fringe element of evangelical life. But I have come to understand that they have had, and others, they're not the only ones, Tony Campolo, we can name others, who have had a very powerful and profound impact, particularly on the younger generation. And so the evangelical community in this country has also begun to change in its views on some of these issues. So that's where we found points of convergence and where we're kind of celebrating and building together. I hope that helps. And sorry for the lengthy
That's
answer.
what I wanted to know. Thank you.
Yes?
You mentioned the 19th century young adult, young youth movement. You just mentioned it again.
Mm-hmm.
I was wondering what your experience with the Interfaith Youth Corps and perhaps movements amongst young adults when it comes to interfaith.
I confess I'm not familiar with the Interfaith Youth Corps, but there's a lot of groupings. One is called, in fact, it's the World Student Christian Federation, the North America section we work closely with at the National Council of Churches. There's another grouping called New Fire, which is a grouping of young adults who are interested in ecumenism. And what we're really trying to do, of course, is to give young seminarians as well as other young people exposure to the ecumenical movement. It's almost like everything else, whether it's trying to help people understand what's the implications of the First Amendment. You get to teach every generation all over again what that's really all about. And similarly, things like the ecumenical and the interfaith movement, as you know, it was mentioned, John mentioned it at the dinner tonight. It was wonderful that it wasn't just all of us older folks there. I don't know how particularly interesting it was or valuable it was for the young people who were present at dinner. It was probably more interesting for us that you were there. But we have to systematically and consciously include younger people in these leadership circles. So I'll give you one last example. The National Council of Churches, when they restructured last year, they decided the only board members would be the heads of denominations. After all, the denominations, shall we say, are the National Council of Churches. Well, once they did that, they counted up and they were like, whoops, 37 denominations led by 31 men out of 37, no one young, so they said we got to do something. So they've added 8 at-large seats, which we're in the process of filling, and we've already been talking about how, we got to make sure that most of them are women, most of them, or at least a good number of them are young people, so there wasn't a conscious decision made to keep it, the leadership just among a bunch of older men, but that was the net effect. But in my experience, working at the national level of major denominations in this country for more than 30 years, there has been for a long, long time a very, very conscious effort to have a very diverse group of leaders at these various denominations, and it's just part of the ethos I have found as we move forward, and I'm grateful to have had that. Thank you, friends, so very, very much for having me here tonight. I'm grateful to you for all you do, and I look forward to staying in touch with you and being in ministry with you as we move forward. Thank you.
Before you go away, please don't forget the event on Sunday at 3 o'clock where we are having not a service of remembrance for John Copenhaver, but a celebration of his 27 years of ministry. He's really worried about all the folks that are going to be speaking, and I've had to assure him multiple times it's not going to be a roast. It's going to be a celebration of the wonderful work that he has done among us. In this, what many you all know him for his interfaith work, but there's so many other arenas that he has touched, and we'll celebrate all of them.
Where will that be, Barry?
At Goodson Chapel.
I want to see if before we go, we used to say, though Adam gets asked, we know that faculty, staff gets asked questions, so student asks questions. So we didn't get to ask the students, we really didn't hear really ask people anyway, we give a student has questions you'd like to ask, because the head of the National Council of Churches, so just have a chance to come up with something. If you don't have something that's on your mind, you got a question you'd like to ask, maybe you need something like that. So this is your opportunity. Or you can ask me one-on-one.
It could even be a question like, what beaches does he recommend to Fiji?
I think James Davis. This is not James Davis, the former president, or a student here with that name. So James Buell, forget.
I just have a quick question. It seems the National Council of Churches is involved in, we talk a lot about political subjects that the National Council of Churches is involved in. Do you have any take on the separation of church and state versus getting involved in that?
Okay.
Good question, right?
James asked about separation of church and state and political statements that the National Council of Churches and other churches make. Let me add, and just kind of picking up on the very beginning of your question, talked a lot about political and social issues. But I mentioned to you, well, I guess, did I mention here or was it dinner? All these different groupings that came together to create the National Council of Churches all those years ago. So the NCC has a lot more to its life than just speaking on social issues. For example, I was involved in a long conversation yesterday about the merits of potentially revising or updating the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. And it was really quite fascinating hearing about a lot of the scholarly work that's taken place in the last 20 years that might lead to that. The National Council of Churches, of course, as I mentioned, has the copyright on the New Revised Standard Version of the Bible. The other thing that I hadn't known is that, in a sense, I'm a graduate of what's called the Committee on the Uniform Series. Doesn't that sound exciting? In other words, for more than 140 years, there has been an ecumenical group that has come together to develop Sunday school curriculum across denominational lines. I did not know that. So the thinking went like this. We may be in different denominations, but as we are committed to training our children and adults in Sunday school, let's have a common curriculum. Now, so the National Council of Churches creates this what's called the detailed outline, and then various denominations take that detailed outline and adapt it, through some of the theological differences that, but in essence, there are millions of youth and adults every Sunday who, unbeknownst to one another, are looking at the same themes, which I really find quite fascinating. That's a very, very important part of the National Council of Churches' life. Now, this question of the churches speaking to political issues is a good one. Some years ago, I had a guy from Iowa, a faithful United Methodist, call me up and he said, I'm coming to Washington, D.C., and I would like to have breakfast with you because I need to tell you that you are breaking the law. Because churches simply can't talk about political issues without, therefore, losing their tax-exempt status from the IRS. So we sat down, and he patiently explained to me why I was a felon and should be locked behind bars. I told him, I said, well, actually, I said, I consulted with the former head of the IRS nonprofit division, who happens to be a lawyer in the United Methodist years ago, and I said, so why aren't people like me behind bars? And he said, because several things. Number one is that you have to do most of your work in ministry has to be around political advocacy. And so when I was at the United Methodist Board of Church and Society, I was the director of one agency of this international denomination of millions of people and tens of thousands of churches. I had 22 staff out of 10 million plus United Methodists around the world. I had a budget that came out to 5% of 1 penny of a dollar that went into the offering plate. So he was telling me, in no way, shape, or form can it be established that the United Methodist Church is a political advocacy organization. You simply don't cross any lines. He said there are a couple other things. You can't endorse political candidates, and we don't. And you can't give campaign contributions, and we don't. And so it's not just the United Methodists, as you know, it's countless faith groups in this country that have a presence, not just in Washington, but in Richmond or in county seats or state capitals around this country and speak to social and political concerns. In a sense, there was a deal made in the 50s, and Lyndon Johnson, who was the majority leader of the United States Senate, helped broker the deal. Now, I'm not a scholar on this issue, but basically it went like this. We don't want the churches to create political parties. And in turn, if so to kind of put you in a category where you won't create political parties, in turn we won't tax you on your property and in other realms. So the faith groups in this country are tax exempt, but we keep our part of the bargain. Now, of course, as you know, in places like Europe, you have in Germany, for example, the Christian Democratic Party. In Italy, you had that. And you have in many countries, you have these Christian or other faith political parties. And it was believed in this country that that wasn't really a healthy way to operate. So the churches can speak, but they can't endorse candidates or give campaign contributions. So I would also put it this way. The church has a responsibility to speak to the state, but the state does not have a responsibility to control the church. So part of the deal also is that in this country we don't have a state church There are in other countries, you know, state churches. In England, the Church of England, which is in this country, the Episcopal Church, that's the state church. In Germany, I believe the Lutheran Church is the state church. But here we said, no, we're not going to do that. So there are actually some give and takes to all of this. So I used to say in church basements, as I would be asked this very question, I would say, so when we go across the street to Congress and offer a firm, polite, moral, and ethical witness, we do so without offering campaign contributions, without threatening to turn members of Congress out of office if they don't support the United Methodist positions, and we don't pray for the death or illness of Supreme Court justices.